Welcome to the Exodus and Beyond. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we'll be exploring the Exodus from an esoteric understanding as explored in my book, The Exodus and Beyond, Book 2 of Unlocking the Dream Vision. In this video, we'll take a look at the Great Exodus out of Egypt, Part 2. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one to the many mysteries we will explore. Picking up where we left off in our last video brings us to the most famous and one of the most controversial parts of the entire Exodus story, the crossing of the Red Sea. Numerous biblical scholars and historians have claimed and argued over the years that this is a typo and that in reality the Bible is speaking of an area known as the Reed Sea that these Hyksos or Hebrews crossed. There's some significant problems with this claim, with the first and most damning one being the simple fact that not one of these biblical scholars have ever presented any actual evidence showing that it is a typo as they claim. What is even more damning is that in the earliest known versions of the Exodus story in ancient Hebrew, they all clearly state that the Red Sea is what they crossed, thereby destroying the scholarly claim of it being the Reed Sea or a typo. The second major problem with this idea is we know precisely where the Reed Sea was and what type of land it actually was. The Reed Sea that the biblical scholars speak of is a long, narrow strip of marshy wetlands that covered in reeds that stretch from the Red Sea's northernmost point up to the Mediterranean Sea. This Reed Sea was destroyed in the 1860s when the Suez Canal was built through the area. This once marshy, reed-covered strip of land was not some problematic area to get through, but was crisscrossed with numerous roads built by the ancient Egyptians because these roads were actually the main trade routes to the east from Egypt. So this idea that the Reed Sea was the location of the Red Sea crossing is obviously being made up by individuals that have no knowledge of the actual area, or they're betting on the simple fact that the average person, especially the typical American, has never actually read the biblical story or would take the time to look it all up on a map. It is also evident that the scholars, taking advantage of the fact that the average person has next to no knowledge of ancient texts or where to get the information in the first place. This should make us very skeptical of anything the experts claim because of a simple reading of the biblical story and looking at Google Earth or another detailed map of the area with a little research would allow someone to quickly see that the scholars and historians are pushing a highly misleading and blatantly false interpretation of the Exodus story. Because if we follow the biblical story and the journey out of Egypt while using a map of the area, we will notice that it takes them to the southernmost point of the Sinai Peninsula by the Straits of Tiran, in the northeastern part of the Red Sea. These are the straits that lead into the Gulf of Aqaba in the northeastern part of the Red Sea. Additionally, and possibly more important, if we look at the entire Red Sea basin on a detailed map showing the ocean seafloor, we will discover that this site is the only possible area of the entire Red Sea basin that the ancient Hebrews could have possibly crossed at. This is because almost the entire Red Sea basin is shaped like a canyon that has sheer drop-offs that extend almost straight down for hundreds and sometimes thousands of feet, approximately 600 to 1,200 feet, or 183 to about 366 meters from the edge of the current shoreline. In comparison, the straits are much more shallower with a gentle slope that a person could easily walk upon if the water was removed. If we look closely at the straits today, we'll see that there are two primary channels. The one on the east side of the straits, closest to Saudi Arabia, is approximately 70 meters deep or 230 feet and a few kilometers across, approximately 1.8 miles. The second channel to the west is approximately 205 meters deep or 675 feet deep and is about 15 kilometers wide or 9.3 miles. There are also a few small islands that lay between the two channels. This is important because if we recall from our esoteric knowledge based on the radioactive evidence, the Exodus occurred approximately 34,000 years ago. This is a time when the Earth was in the middle of the last great ice age that made the planet a vastly different world than the one we see today. One of the most striking features that impacted the entire globe at this time was that the sea levels were much lower than today, with it estimated that the world's oceans were on average about 125 meters or 410 feet lower than they are today. If we could go back to this ancient time, we would find that the Red Sea was a much smaller body of water than it is today. It would have been a long, narrow sea that was lined with narrow beaches that ran to sheer cliffs hundreds of feet high on both sides of the sea for much of its length. Not only would the entire Red Sea look different, but the straits would have also been entirely different than what we see today. If we strip away the water and account for the 34,000 years of erosion, we end up with only one shallow channel that may have been approximately 800 to 900 meters or 2,600 feet to 2,950 feet wide in less than approximately 100 feet of water or 30 meters. It would also not be out of the question that this channel would have been even shallower, with it being less than 50 feet or 15 meters deep due to tidal changes and storms. By realizing how shallow the waters were at this ancient time in these straits, it makes it easy to understand and imagine that if a large storm was to develop in the right place in the Red Sea basin, it could suck up vast amounts of water that would actually empty the straits, which would have allowed the ancient Hebrews to cross on relatively dry ground to the other side. Then a short time later, as the Egyptians entered the now empty straits, pursuing their former slaves, the storm would have naturally moved away while dropping all the water that it had sucked up and emptied the strait. This would have created a massive storm surge that would have been forced back violently into the straits, which would have easily wiped out the Egyptians, as it is recorded in the Bible. This allows us to realize that this could have been a completely natural event. However, it would have been viewed as a great miracle by those who saw it happen, especially after the recent events of the plagues. The only problem with this entire scenario would be the timing of getting the Hebrews there at the right moment to cross, as the water was being sucked out of the straits by a massive storm. However, we are told in the Exodus story that the Hebrews had camped for a short period of time before the parting of the Red Sea. We're also told in both the biblical account and the Dream Vision of Enoch that the Lord God of the Hebrews impeded the forces of Pharaoh for a short period of time before allowing them to enter the crossing in pursuit. Both accounts indicate that some sort of timing was involved, which could be explained by a massive storm and having to wait for it to form and move. The biblical account of the parting of the Red Sea also adds significant weight to this idea that an unusually large storm may have been responsible for one of the greatest miracles of the Bible. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. After crossing the Red Sea, the Bible says that the Hebrews then journeyed to the mountain of God, better known as Mount Sinai in the tradition. The actual location of Mount Sinai as described in the Bible remains a hotly disputed topic. But if we consider the ancient Hebrews crossing the Red Sea through the Straits of Tiran, then closely follow the directions given in the book of Exodus, they will lead us to a 2,580 meter tall or 8,000 foot tall mountain called Mount Jabal al-Lawz in western Saudi Arabia, whose coordinates are below so you can look at them. This is a highly unusual mountain that numerous people over the years have suspected to be the real Mount Sinai of biblical tradition. One of the most striking features of this mountain is that the entire top part of the mountain is covered in black rock, but not from volcanic activity. The top of this mountain is strangely covered with countless pieces of burnt granite, which is a clear indication that at some ancient point in time, the entire top of this mountain was subjected to extreme heat close to the melting point of granite, which is around 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. This burnt granite appears to be evidence of the events described in the Bible of when the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob descended from the sky and sat upon his holy mountain, as described in the book of Exodus. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceedingly loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood on neither part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. Exodus chapter 19, verses 16 to 18. In addition to the burnt granite below the mountain on the plain that the ancient Hebrews would have camped upon, there's a central large stone that has numerous pictographs of cattle carved upon it, which seems to support the famous golden calf story of the Bible when the Hebrews turned their backs upon God. Close to this large altar-like stone is another site that has 12 stone pillars built around another large stone that looks like an altar, which according to Exodus in chapters 20 and 24, Moses set up an altar at the foot of the mountain after writing down God's laws in the book of the covenant. The altar was for burnt sacrifices and peace offerings of sheep and cattle, and was to be constructed without steps and without cut or chiseled stone. Next to this altar, Moses was commanded to construct 12 stone pillars that symbolized the 12 tribes of Israel. These sites, along with others around the base of the mountain, help to support the idea that this mount is the actual Mount Sinai of the biblical story. Remarkably, the government of Saudi Arabia has forbidden visitation to the sites of the possible altars and pillars, and claim the site is historically insignificant. They have not offered any explanation on why the site is forbidden, nor why outside experts have not been permitted to examine the site, even under supervision. The Saudi government has also blocked off all paths to the sites with fences and warning signs. They've also built a police station in front of the site, with the area being patrolled regularly. The patrols are known to approach those who get too close to the fences and follow them anywhere in the vicinity of this mountain. Although this is not proof, the current actions of the Saudi government restricting access to the sites are highly suspicious, and this site is much more important than they would like the public to believe. According to the Bible, it is at this point in the journey that the Hyksos elite begin calling themselves the Israelites, which roughly translates into English meaning men who saw God. After the events surrounding the mountain of God, the Israelites then begin their long journey into the wilderness to the promised land, the land of Canaan. Remarkably, the Bible does not say where the promised land of Canaan was actually located. There are numerous vague references in the biblical text that place its location in reference to unknown rivers and cities whose locations have either been forgotten or have yet to be found. However, the actual truth is, the Bible does not actually say where the ancient land of Canaan was located at. Nevertheless, there are a few critical clues to its location contained within the book of Numbers when the Israelites departed from Mount Sinai, in the story of the spies that Moses sent into the land of Canaan once they had arrived at its borders. According to the book of Numbers, after spending 2 years, 2 months, and 20 days, the Israelites left their encampment at the base of the mountain of God. We are told they first embarked upon a 3-day journey which brought them to the edge of a vast wilderness. This would have placed them at the edge of the northeastern desert of modern-day Saudi Arabia. The Bible then implies that from this point they journeyed straight to the promised land of Canaan. The traditional interpretation is that the Israelites then began a journey northwards toward the area of what is today modern-day Israel and the city of Jerusalem. This traditional interpretation makes absolutely no sense. This is because the ancient Egyptians were still entirely in control of this area, and it would have been impossible for these shepherd kings to actually return to this area under Egyptian control. This is the critical clue that allows us to realize that the traditional interpretation is wrong. However, although the traditional interpretation is wrong, it does provide us with the next critical clue that there were only two possible directions the ancient Israelites could have taken, with one being south and the other being east. If we follow this incomplete information given in the book of Numbers and the Bible in general, there's no information or references to that the Israelites traveled south along the Red Sea. This actually leaves only one possible direction left for the Israelites to have journeyed, and that is eastward to the vast wilderness that we now call Saudi Arabia. The Bible also implies that the Israelites went directly to the land of Canaan once they had left the edge of the wilderness. This means that they would have traveled eastward from the mount across northern Saudi Arabia to the area that lays approximately between the border of modern-day Kuwait and Saudi Arabia on the east coast of the Persian Gulf. However, 34,000 years ago, the entire Persian Gulf of today was one broad and long valley with one large river composed of the Euphrates and Tigris that flowed eventually into the Arabian Sea. In the book of Numbers, we are told that once the Israelites had arrived at the borders of the Promised Land, Moses chose men from each tribe to go into this land as spies to see what type of land it was and what type of people lived there. Upon their return after 40 days of searching the land, these spies described where they went and what they saw. Our next clue to the location of the land of Canaan comes from the group of spies that goes to the south of the land, where they find the people were strong and lived in great walled cities, and more importantly, they saw the children of Enoch, a people who have been traditionally believed to be very close to being the giants of legends. Then the spies described to Moses that the Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the seas and by the coast of Jordan. Numbers chapter 13, verses 29. This description in no way matches the traditional interpretation that the land of Canaan is the area of the modern-day nation-state of Israel. One of the essential clues in this verse is that the Canaanites dwell by the sea, by the coast of Jordan, which implies that Jordan is not a river as traditionally believed, but is actually a land that is next to a large body of water. By realizing that the main body of the Israelites were in the area of the northern part of the valley that is today the Persian Gulf, the description given in the book of Numbers begins to make more sense and appears to be describing the southwestern lands of the modern-day nation of Iran, especially when we remember that 34,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf was a long, broad valley that had a massive river running its length that was fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It is also believed by experts that there may have been numerous large lakes and maybe a couple smaller lakes that were fed by this river system as it meandered through the valley. However, before we can explore this idea in more depth, we need to first examine the part of the story of the spies sent into the land of Canaan and the events that took place after they returned and reported what they had seen. Once the spies had reported back to Moses and the Israelites, the people began to murmur and refuse to go into the land of Canaan and fight the strong people that lived there. For this transgression and the refusal to follow the commands of their Lord, the Israelites were punished by having to wander the wilderness for 40 years until that generation who transgressed against their Lord had passed from the earth. We are then vaguely told that the Israelites' wanderings through the wilderness until the first generation had passed from the earth, and their children and their children's children were the ones that were now following Moses. The Bible also tells us during this time the Israelites had grown in massive numbers and were far larger than the original group of the 80,000 Hyksos that originally had left Egypt. After 40 years of wandering, the children of Israel eventually returned to enter the Promised Land. However, unlike before, we are provided with much more information about the location of these children of Israel and their eventual crossing Jordan into the promised land of Canaan. After 40 years of wandering through the wilderness, the Bible states that these children of Israel come to and camp upon the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho. In order for us to figure out where these plains of Moab and Jordan near Jericho were and the real location of the land of Canaan was actually located, we need to return to the book of Numbers and the few additional clues that it contains. Our first clue to the location can be found in chapter 31 of the book of Numbers, where the Israelites are commanded by the Lord God to conquer a people called the Mennonites. The book of Numbers provides a surprisingly detailed account of the Mennonites' destruction at the hands of the Israelites. It also gives us a view into the world of the tribes of the children of Israel, more or less how they operated as pillagers, marauders, looters, and bandits as they moved around the wilderness in their wanderings. In this chapter, we're told that the Israelite army killed all the men of the Mennonites on the battlefield and then took all the remaining men, women, and children as captives, along with all their cattle, their flocks, and their goods. And we're then told that all these captives, except those few female children and young women who had not known man by laying with them, were all then brutally murdered in cold blood. The remaining surviving virgin women and female children were then taken by the different male members of the various tribes as wives. This is an example of how the Israelites' numbers were able to grow. They simply just conquered other people and took their young female virgins as wives, and then they killed every other man, woman, and child that they came across. Although this type of behavior may seem harsh or even brutal, it was a common practice in the ancient world to kill every single person of a conquered people, except for the female virgins, who would then become wives of the conquerors. Once the Mennonites had been destroyed and the bounty and women split up among the various tribes of the children of Israel, the Bible then says the children of Israel began to prepare to enter the land of Canaan, with them staging an invasion on the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho. This is our next clue that the ancient land of Canaan are not the lands in and around modern-day Israel. To understand how this very short phrase is the key to realizing that the entire traditional interpretation that this verse is describing the area around the river Jordan in modern-day Israel is incorrect. We must first understand the origin and meaning of the words Jordan and Jericho. Additionally, we must also understand that the word near was added when the Bible was translated in English in the 1600s and not contained within the original text, which then changes the phrase, the plains of Moab, by Jordan, Jericho. The next step is to understand the origin of the ancient Hebrew meaning of the words Jordan and Jericho. The origin of the word Jordan is believed to be derived from the Hebrew word yarden, which means to flow down or descend. In modern terms, it simply means a place where water flows down, or a waterfall. The origin of the word Jericho is unknown, but is believed to be possibly from or is related to the Hebrew words yarich, which means moon, and the word riach, which means fragrant. With our understanding of the mystical esoteric symbolism and the secret history of creation that it holds, we can quickly realize that the symbolism of the moon and its traditional relationship to the mother goddess. We also have the additional possible meaning of fragrant to moon, which we can easily realize must be referring to a temple or holy site that is dedicated to the earth mother or mother goddess. When we combine this with the ancient meaning of the word Jericho, meaning to flow down, we can recognize the esoteric meaning that this is describing a temple dedicated to the mother goddess near a river flowing through a valley in the land of Jordan, located near the plains of Moab. This understanding allows us to realize for the first time that this part of the story is not speaking of a city named Jericho, as so commonly believed, but is really speaking of a temple dedicated to the moon or mother goddess that is in the land of Jordan by a river that flows by it, or Jericho, close to a waterfall. As with all ancient temple complex, the temple would have been supported by a nearby city which, according to the Bible, was the first city the Israelites conquered once they had entered the land of Canaan, commonly known as Jericho. When we combine this information with our knowledge that the Persian Gulf did not exist at this ancient time, we can easily see on any map of the area, just to the west of the long, shallow valley, there was and still is a great broad plain as described in the biblical text. Today is a sandy, vast plain that makes up the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. But 34,000 years ago, it would have been a much more lush grassland and savanna-like environment. Our next major clue comes from the description given in chapter 34, verses 1 through 14 in the book of Numbers, where Moses is shown the border of the lands of Canaan by his Lord shortly before his death. Both Jews and Christians traditionally believe that the descriptions given in chapter 34 of the book of Numbers is describing the area between the Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea, the northern part of the Red Sea, and the small river or stream known as Jordan in modern-day Israel. However, the large area between the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the northern mountain ranges between the two areas, including the strip of land following the Zagros Mountains southwards toward the Arabian Sea, and what we see in the modern-day nation of Iran, is a much better fit to what is described in the Bible. We're also provided with additional information on the day Moses dies. Before his death, he's commanded by the Lord to get thee up into the mountain Abarim, onto the Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, that is over against Jericho, and behold the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel's possession. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 49. By understanding that the plains of Moab were located on the western side of the broad valley of what is today the Persian Gulf, we can realize that there is only one large mountain on the western side of the Persian Gulf that matches this description of Mount Nebo in the Bible, which is the 9,957 foot tall or 3,035 meter tall Mount Jebel Shams, which is located in the southeastern part of the Arabian Peninsula in the modern nation state of Oman. It is the highest peak in the grouping of mountains known as the Hajar Range that overlook the waters of the Persian Gulf. But 34,000 years ago, instead of looking across the waters of the Persian Gulf, Moses would have seen a great river that had whipped through this great valley, going around the mountains slightly to the north, and then run down into what is the northern part of the Arabian Sea, forming a large delta area. Given the geographical layout of this part of the Persian Gulf, this river would have flown down a rather steep slope before it flattened out into a delta region as it emptied into the Arabian Sea. We put all these clues together, and we can realize that 34,000 years ago, this entire area would have been a lush land with abundant plant life, wildlife, and fresh water. An abundant, beautiful land that must have seemed like the perfect place to build a temple dedicated to the Earth Mother, or Earth Goddess, and life itself, that was by the plains of Moab in the land of Jordan, where the waters flow down, or as the Bible records it, the plains of Moab, by Jordan, Jericho. But also realizing that the Mount Jebel Shams is in the modern day nation of Oman, may be the Mount Nebo that Moses was commanded to stand upon. We can understand for the first time in modern history that the ancient Israelites must have been camped just west of the northwest parts of the Strait of Hormuz, and later crossed into the land of Canaan in this general area. Understanding this allows us to say with some confidence that the ancient land of Canaan was actually located in the area that is now today the modern nation of Iran, and not the lands of modern-day Israel, almost 1,187 miles to the west. This is the esoteric knowledge of the true location of the ancient land of Canaan. However, this esoteric interpretation may be a bit difficult for many to accept at the moment. However, we will explore why this knowledge was lost and why the modern-day nation of Israel has become known as the Land of Canaan. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos.